Over the course of the last 15 years or so, the music of the band Yes has been officially or semi-officially been presented to the public by two different touring bands, each led by a member of the band's classic lineup. The current touring version of Yes has existed for about 10 years now and is led by their guitarist Steve Howe. The other band that presents Yes music is led by Yes's ex-lead singer Jon Anderson, and there have been various versions of this band presented, the most recent being the version that Jon Anderson fronts with Richie Castellano and Castellano's collection of musicians from New York City called the band Geeks. Both do fine jobs of presenting Yes's music to the public. There are some Yes fans out there who, when considering the advancing ages of the members of the band, as I make this video in mid-2025, Jon Anderson is just several months shy of his 81st birthday, and Steve Howe has recently turned 78. There are fans out there who, based on this, would like to see the various hatchets that separate these musicians be buried and see Anderson and Howe reunite with various others of the musicians that have supported them in recent years to put together one last shot at a unified band vision so that we can remember them in the way that we would like to, hearkening back to the band's glory days of the 1970s. I am here to tell you in this episode that I don't think that is ever going to happen. The short version of why has to do with both leadership of the band and finances. When it comes to leadership, both Jon Anderson and Steve Howe are famously control freaks of a sort, and they're each now running their own version of Yes in a sense, and those versions of Yes suit them very well. As far as finances are concerned, I don't think that would be possible for either Anderson or Howe to be doing better financially with a unified Yes than with the units that they're currently running. For the long-form explanation of why I think that, one has to go back to the very beginnings of the band and to various key points in the band's history over the course of the last 55 or so years. Yes was founded in 1968 by Jon Anderson and the bass player Chris Squire. Squire and Anderson had a great affinity for each other's style of music, and Squire in particular was good at crafting songs that complemented Anderson's very unique high tenor voice. But this was more than a musical union between Anderson and Squire. Both Anderson and Squire had had a taste of the big time prior to forming Yes. Anderson with his earlier band, The Warriors, and Squire with his earlier band, The Sin. Both of them wanted more. They were keenly wanting success, and success in a big way. These guys were not just musicians, and to be more to the point, they weren't the stereotypical psychedelic musicians who just cared about being one with society and presenting their music. They wanted success. They wanted the money. This first became clear with the band's first personnel change in 1970, when Anderson and Squire dismissed Peter Banks, who was a fine guitar player, but not a player who was particularly interested in writing original music, and replaced him with Steve Howe. Howe was, like Anderson and Squire, very success motivated. He had been, prior to Yes, with a couple of bands, Tomorrow and Bodast, that again had tasted success through recording contracts and touring around various parts of Europe. He had also been considered as a member of both the Nice and of Jethro Tull. So these were guys who were at the top of the food chain as far as the progressive rock genre were concerned. They were talented, and they wanted success. Yes brought in a manager who was like-minded to pursue that as well, Brian Lane. And with this cadre of very talented musicians in place, Anderson, Squire, and Howe, Yes went on a tear throughout the 70s, creating some very special music, beginning with the 1971 The Yes album and continuing through till 1978 with Tormato. Various changes, of course, took place in Yes over this period of time. Yes's original keyboardist, Tony Kaye, was dismissed in favor of the great Rick Wakeman. Wakeman himself would leave the band for a time to be replaced by an equally excellent musician, Patrick Moraz, before Wakeman would again return to the band in 1976. Yes's original drummer, the great Bill Bruford, would also leave after completing their fifth album, Close to the Edge, to be replaced by the long-term drummer with the band, Alan White. By 1978 and Tormato, Yes were at something of a crossroads. The Tormato album was quite successful in its own right. In the United States, it had reached number 15 on the Billboard charts and had gone platinum. But it had fallen off the charts very quickly. It was, in fact, the first Yes album to find its way to the cutout bins in the United States. By the late 1970s, of course, the golden age of progressive rock was reaching its end. And there were other forms of music, including disco, punk rock, and the emerging new wave format that were becoming of interest to fans across the world. And Yes's label, Atlantic Records, while they wanted to see Yes continue and be successful, also wanted to see Yes acknowledge that the world was changing and for the band to change with it. Steve Howe, Chris Squire, and Alan White were all willing and eager to make changes to Yes's musical style to incorporate new forms. Rick Wakeman, and particularly Jon Anderson, were not at this point in time. Anderson viewed his voice as being a special instrument in its own right, and he couldn't see how that instrument could be applied to some of these other musical forms. And so, in early 1980, Anderson withdrew from the band. Rick Wakeman quickly followed. Yes soldiered on. Their manager, Brian Lane, in 1980, had recently become manager of a successful new wave band called The Buggles, featuring Trevor Horn and Jeffrey Downes. Horn and Downes joined Yes to replace Anderson and Wakeman, and they became Yes for about a year or so, releasing one quite successful album, Drama. It became clear, though, as Yes toured Europe, and particularly the UK, that audiences there were not particularly accepting of Horn as a replacement for Jon Anderson on stage. And so, after completing their tour for the Drama album in 1981, Yes broke up, briefly. During this time, the various members of Yes pursued other projects. Jon Anderson released his second solo album in this period, Song of Seven, and renewed a friendship with the Greek keyboardist Vangelis, with whom he made a couple of albums in the early 1980s timeframe. These records, unfortunately, didn't do very well for Anderson, however. The world was indeed changing musically. There wasn't really a place on radio for this music to be played, and given the advent of new wave music, and in particular the emergence of the MTV cable network, which became a major force in making people aware of new music, Anderson found himself at a crossroads at this point in time. Steve Howe, by comparison, was doing very well in the early 1980s, following his tenure in Yes. He joined the band Asia, whose first two albums were very successful, the first of the two going diamond in the United States for sales of 10 million over the course of time. This would not continue for Howe for very long due to conflicts within the band, particularly between Howe and the band's lead singer and bassist, John Wetton. But Howe definitely made the mark that he was able to be successful in other than the context of Yes. Chris Squire and Alan White pursued projects as well. After cutting the EP Run with the Fox shortly after the demise of Yes, Squire and White began the XYZ project with Jimmy Page, which at least on paper looked like a very good match of musicians that could do well in the marketplace. However, this was not to be. XYZ was unable to find a suitable lead singer. Squire wasn't able to carry that load himself, and the singer Jimmy Page had in mind, his bandmate from Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant, wasn't interested in the position. And so XYZ would ultimately fizzle after a few months. Squire and White then linked up with the South African guitar player Trevor Rabin, who, coupled with their ex-bandmate Trevor Horn, who signed on to assist the band with production and songwriting, and Yes's original keyboard player Tony Kaye, launched a new project, Cinema, and signed with Atlantic Records to be able to move that project forward. In working with Cinema, Chris Squire recognized that while the music was strong, that it could be made stronger, and he had an idea of how to do that. That idea was to include Jon Anderson into the mix. Squire reached out to Anderson, and Anderson joined the band, which, with now 4 ex-members of Yes being part of it, Atlantic Records saw the wisdom to call this project Yes as well, perhaps to Trevor Rabin's chagrin. This version of Yes was remarkably successful. Their first album, 90125, was a multi-platinum success, and they followed it up with another multi-platinum success several years later, releasing the album Big Generator in 1987, 4 years after 90125. While this version of Yes was very successful, Jon Anderson wasn't pleased being a part of it. Jon Anderson was no longer the star. If anything, the star of the band had emerged as being Trevor Rabin. Rabin was the chief organizer behind the project. He was not the credited producer on these early efforts from the new Yes, but he definitely had Trevor Horn's ear and was the primary songwriter for the band's work. Where Anderson felt he needed to actively be involved in songwriting in order to create music that highlighted the unique qualities of his voice, Rabin and Horn were not very interested in having Anderson participate in the songwriting process to any great extent. Horn in particular felt that the old style of Yes music was not going to sell in the new marketplace, and Horn and Rabin kept Anderson at considerable length from the songwriting process, only allowing him to contribute to songwriting when songs were nearly complete. Anderson was not happy with this approach at all, and shortly after Big Generator was issued, made the decision to leave the band. He would leave Yes in the spring of 1988, following Yes's performance at Atlantic Records' 40th anniversary concert at Madison Square Garden. Anderson signed with Arista Records and quickly began putting together a new slate of songs for an album. Anderson was enough of a businessman at this point to recognize that a Jon Anderson solo project was not going to do anywhere near as well in the marketplace as something that harkened back to his work in Yes. Given this, he reached out to some old friends to assist him in his project, to Steve Howe for guitar work, to Rick Wakeman for keyboards, and to Bill Bruford to play drums. And the result was Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe. Yes in all but name, and including all the members of the classic version of Yes, except for Chris Squire, who at this time was still working with Trevor Rabin and with Trevor Horn. When the other members of ABWH joined Anderson, Anderson had all but completed the songs for the album. Bill Bruford recalled in particular that he had very little room to develop drum parts for Anderson's songs, that most of the drum work had already been done by drum machines, and that it was very closely scoped out that really all he needed to do is replace the beats from the drum machines with his own. Similarly, Steve Howe remembered that there was very little work that he could do on the songs as well. From a public perspective, however, the album was positioned as a Yes project with all songs credited to Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe on the record jacket. In something of a take this to Chris Squire, Trevor Horn, and Trevor Rabin, Anderson insisted when the album came out that the catalog number that Arista assigned to it be 90126, a thinly veiled message telling Horn, Rabin, and Squire that Anderson felt this was the album that Yes should have made instead of Big Generator. ABWH was a strong success in the marketplace. The album hit number 30 on the U.S. Billboard charts and was certified as gold. It didn't, however, stay on the charts for very long, and in fact, within about a year or so of its release, found its way to the cutout bins. The band, however, was a huge success on stage, and Arista wanted a follow-up, and they wanted it quickly. The band had a hard time getting a follow-up together. Collaboration was difficult. Over the course of work on the second ABWH album, Anderson and Howe had apparently a rather nasty falling out. Rick Wakeman also became agitated as the sessions went on with Anderson and with his producer of choice, Jonathan Elias. When the band ultimately had enough songs together to present an album to Arista, Arista rejected it, feeling that it was not an album that could sell in the current marketplace, and that in particular, it needed a hit single in order to move it forward. Jon Anderson reluctantly reached out to Trevor Rabin and asked for a song. Trevor Rabin provided 3, saying that Anderson could use only one of the 3. Anderson decided that he wanted them all. At this point in time, the official version of Yes, with Rabin, Chris Squire, and Alan White, was having difficulty too. They had not had a significant amount of luck replacing Jon Anderson as a lead vocalist. The plan that they had had that they thought was going to work for a while was to enlist the ex-singer from Supertramp, Roger Hodgson. But those plans ultimately fell through. The idea was struck that maybe these two bands could work together and tour together. And so the Union project was born. The Union album was, by most accounts, something of an abomination. As I mentioned, neither Howe nor Wakeman were fond of the album. As the album was developed in the studio, multiple session musicians were brought in, eradicating parts that were provided by various of the members of Yes, which added considerable fuel to an already simmering fire. Rick Wakeman would ultimately go on record famously as saying he couldn't call the album Union. He refers to it as Onion because he cries every time he thinks about it. The tour behind Union was very successful, even though the album was critically panned and the members of the band were not particularly happy with Anderson or with the album. Following the Union tour, Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman made the decision to leave this version of Yes, and in the wake of those departures, Arista Records would drop Yes from their roster. Yes's next record would be with the short-lived Victory Music label, a label run by Phil Carson, who had been an executive at Atlantic. Carson, however, in signing Yes, wanted to see them go forward with the 80s 90125 configuration of the band, with Trevor Rabin in the lead. This version of Yes would make just one album, Talk, which was not a bad album, but it was, again, not what Anderson wanted to do at all. I'm sure Anderson was particularly irritated at the fact that Trevor Rabin, in making the album, ultimately used a song that was written during the brief time that Roger Hodgson worked with Yes, and on which Hodgson received a songwriting credit. Matters were not helped in that Victory Music effectively went bankrupt during the tour that Yes did to support Talk. Following the Talk tour, this version of Yes broke up, and it appeared that the band was done. And it was, for a short time. They regrouped shortly afterward, effectively as the classic Yes lineup, with Jon Anderson fronting Steve Howe, Rick Wakeman, Chris Squire, and Alan White on tours, as well as occasionally making new studio recordings as well. This version of the band would make studio records over the first several years of its existence. But after making Magnification in 2001, even Jon Anderson would tell the press that he was losing interest in making studio recordings, seeing that there wasn't very much of a market for them, and that smaller and smaller labels were expressing interest in distributing Yes's product. Yes had, by the early 2000s, become something of a nostalgia act, and they did well on the road, but their records at this point were not selling, not the new ones anyway. Their catalog items on Atlantic were definitely doing well, but the new albums, not so much. The final straw, the incident that would ultimately end Jon Anderson's tenure in the official version of Yes, took place in the year 2008. In 2008, Yes was planning to celebrate the band's 40th anniversary. While they were playing healthy-sized venues during the late 90s and early 2000s, following the regrouping of the classic lineup, they were not playing large venues or stadiums any longer. With the 40th anniversary tour, Yes planned a larger tour than usual, playing larger venues and covering a significant amount of their back catalog material. As luck would have it, however, this would happen without Jon Anderson. Anderson suffered a bout of asthma in 2008 that sidelined him for a considerable period of time. It was Anderson's hope that the band would be put on ice while he recovered from his illness. With many of the venues already being booked for the 40th anniversary tour, however, the business side of Yes, as often was the case, took precedence over the artistic. Yes recruited a new lead singer, the Canadian Benoit David, to take Anderson's place, and went on tour without Anderson for the first time since 1981. Anderson was understandably rather upset by this and said so in the press. He made a point of telling the press that what was out on the road was not Yes, as if to imply that Yes only could legitimately lay claim to the title if he were part of it. Over the course of this time, Anderson attempted to restart his career in much the same way as he did during the late 80s in the ABWH time frame. He rekindled his relationship with Rick Wakeman, and the two of them went on a duo tour for about 2 years or so in 2010 and 2011. I, in particular, saw one of their duo shows in late 2011 and was very impressed at what those two were able to accomplish, even with no other musicians on stage. In 2012, Anderson received what he perceived as yet another slap in the face from Yes when Benoit David was replaced with John Davison, the singer with Glass Hammer. Anderson's statement to the press at this time was that Yes, by not reaching out to him to take his rightful place in the band, were letting a lot of fans down. Anderson's ultimate response to this was to expand his work with Wakeman, also adding Trevor Rabin to the mix. The band that he fronted during this time would work together for several years in direct competition with the touring version of Yes under Steve Howe, Chris Squire, and Alan White. Chris Squire sadly would pass in 2015 and Alan White in 2022, leaving Steve Howe as the linchpin of the current touring version of Yes. The current touring Yes is a very fine band. It includes Jeffrey Downes from the drama lineup, who has had a long-standing relationship with Steve Howe, including the time that they spent together in the band Asia. It also includes bassist and singer Billy Sherwood, who was handpicked by Chris Squire to replace him when Squire learned that he was terminally ill. And it includes the drummer Jay Schellen, who was Alan White's handpicked replacement and who worked as a second drummer with Yes for much of the 2010 decade. The current version of Yes is unfortunately not without its difficulties on stage. In particular, Steve Howe suffers from arthritis. He has now for several years, and that occasionally gets in the way of his performances. I saw the band in particular in 2019 when they were headlining the Royal Affair Tour and witnessed on a couple of songs situations where Steve Howe was literally not able to keep up with the rest of the band when executing his solos. One would hope that the band would be able to, in the selection of their material, avoid circumstances like this. But one of the things about arthritis that I've learned myself as I get older is that you don't necessarily always know when bouts of pain are going to strike you. Jon Anderson, over the course of the last several years, has had something of a resurgence, by comparison. In linking up with Richie Castellano and the band Geeks, he's found a band that is very adept at recreating the classic work of Yes, and evidently is willing to do that in such manner where Jon Anderson is able to make a considerable profit from his live performances. I would dare say that the members of the band Geeks, save for their leader, Richie Castellano, don't make very much money when compared to the members of Yes on their tours. So Anderson and Castellano, I'm sure, are doing quite well as a result of their working together. By virtue of their success with this project, Jon Anderson has also been able to rekindle the public interest in his solo material outside of Yes. Anderson, backed by Castellano and the band Geeks, made a new album in 2024, Thru, which definitely illustrates this. While the album wasn't a huge seller, it definitely found a market through the longtime fans of Yes, who, along with the critics, basically have reported that even at the age of 80, Jon Anderson has not really lost very much of his edge as a vocalist, that he still does very, very well with the new material, as well as with the classic Yes material on stage. All this to say, at this point in time, Jon Anderson is very happy. In a recent interview, he made a comment when asked about mending fences with Steve Howe and Yes, that he had found the Yes he wants to be in at this point in time. And from a financial and a creative control perspective, I'm sure that's true. As far as the touring Yes is concerned, they are a fine band, and hopefully more frequently than not, Steve Howe and his arthritis are able to deliver the types of performances that we know that he is generally able to. So we have two bands that are operating at the professional level who can deliver this music well. Do I think they're ever going to get together again? Probably not. But certainly between the product that Jon Anderson and Richie Castellano are presenting on one hand versus what Steve Howe, Jeff Downes, Billy Sherwood, and their band are presenting on the other, there's definitely some good music out there from these guys that we can hopefully enjoy for a few years longer. Anyway, that's all for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it as always. If you have comments on what I've presented here, by all means, please feel free to share. I know there are some very loyal Yes fans out there, and I wouldn't be surprised if I've said something to upset one of them along the way. So, by all means, Let me know what you think. I'll do my best to answer. If you liked the episode, of course, please click on like and let me know that as well. And if you're not a member of Propaganda, if you're not a subscriber at this point, of course, please join. We're back here on a regular basis with more interesting stories. You take good care. Bye-bye.